I wanted to go ahead and introduce our panelists and our special guest. On our honorary board is Michael Morell, who is also one of our panelists today. So Mr. Morell is one of the country's most renowned national security professionals. He most recently served as the Deputy Director of the CIA and twice served as its acting director. He served for more than 30 years in the agency, where he played a central role in the United States' fight against terrorism. During his agency career, he also served as the director of the Office of Asia Pacific and Latin American Analysis. He also served as George W. Bush's intelligence briefer. Since November 2013, he has been a senior counselor with Beacon Global Strategies. So we're excited to have Mike Morell with us. Our other panelist is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani was the senior advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. He was the director of the National Counterproliferation Center and the Intelligence Community Mission Manager for North Korea. He also served at the State Department as a special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea. His distinguished career with the CIA included serving as the Director of East Asia Operations, the Director of the Office of Technical Services, and the Director of Public Affairs. So we're thrilled to have Joseph DeTrani with us today. And our moderator. Our moderator is our very own curator and historian, Dr. Vince Houghton. He has a PhD in intelligence history from the University of Maryland with a specialization in nuclear intelligence. He served in the U.S. Army in the 90s in the Balkans, where he worked with both military and civilian intelligence agencies. He is currently working tirelessly with our spy exhibits team to develop our content for our new museum. And that has included trips around the country, even around the world, in a search for new artifacts. So we're thrilled to have Vince serve as our moderator today.
Wow. It'd be very difficult for a lot of people to identify, let's say, who is in charge of China today, or a vast majority of countries inside of Europe. But Kim Jongun might be a household name for a lot of Americans now. There's a cult of personality that surrounds the North Korean leader. So let's start with one of the most basic questions. Within the intelligence community, there is a type of analyst called a leadership analyst. I'm sure they're very busy when dealing with North Korea. And so let's start with the basics. Can we deal with Kim Jong-un the same way we would deal with any other leader around the world? Is he a rational actor? Let's start with you, Ambassador.
Well, let me just say, Kim Jong-un is a rational actor as he sees issues. And what he's been able to do over the last 5.5 years is to make North Korea the issue for all countries, certainly to include the United States. So yes, he's a rational actor, but he's an unpredictable actor. He's a brutal actor. He's an actor who really, let me be very straight on this, who has consolidated power through force, brutality, and fear. Anyone who can kill their uncle the way he did with Jong Sung-taek and take his half-brother Kim Jong-nam down with the VX nerve agent tells you the type of person we're dealing with. So yes, the question is, he's consolidated power. From his vantage point, he's rational. When we look at him, he's an extremely dangerous, unpredictable actor with nuclear weapons, missile delivery systems, chemical, biological, cyber, and other capabilities. That's the person we're dealing with.
So I'd say we're absolutely dealing with a rational actor in his worldview. His worldview is that the United States of America is trying to overthrow his regime. He believes that deeply. He believes that the Central Intelligence Agency is working on that as we speak. It's not. But he believes it, and he sees all of these weapons systems as the ultimate deterrence from the United States overthrowing him. So he sees them as key to regime survival. So he's wrong about his worldview, but he's very rational within it.
A lot of people look at him as the key to everything, much in the same way they looked at his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and then his father, Kim Jong-il. Is he someone that you could remove from power? I'm not saying through covert means, but let's say the beginning of some kind of war, a decapitating strike, and things would be any better in North Korea? Or is it just the system itself that produces someone like Kim Jong-un versus Kim Jong-un being the director of the system?
Well, let me just say, it's the Kim family. And we have Kim Jong-un in charge because mainly it is the Kim family. So that's a powerful thing, having the Kim family there. The half-brother that he assassinated with VX nerve agent was very adamant in saying this should not be a hereditary type leadership in North Korea. This is not what it was meant to be. So the answer is the Kim family resonates because of Kim Il-sung. It resonates with the people. If he should be removed from the scene, if there's another Kim, and Kim Jong-un he took care of, there's a younger brother and there's a younger sister, the family there. He removed many of those generals and those very senior people to include his uncle, who was technically the regent, the number 2 person there. So yes, there would be others, but the difficulty, I think, and I'll look to you, Michael, on this, the difficulty is we don't have the granularity we need. This is a country that's not been exposed to the West, the outside world, even to China. Very few have visited China, certainly South Korea, very few. Kim Jong-chol, maybe a few others. So we're dealing with, when we speak of the Hermit Kingdom, we are talking about a country that's been cloistered, a group of people that's lived amongst themselves. And when you become that xenophobic, I'm not sure changing the individual, an individual who hasn't been exposed to whether it's economic reforms in China, whether it's the developments in the East Asia, the West, and so forth, whether that person would be receptive. It gets back to Michael's point about having nuclear weapons and being treated. This is an important point, ladies and gentlemen, because history resonates. When we're talking about China, we talk about 100 years of humiliation. When we talk about North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom, we're talking about 2,000 years of recorded history. Over 500, if you could believe it, invasions. Countries like China, Mongolia, Japan, Russia, occupying them. So there is this element of xenophobia, this element of we need to be strong and having nuclear weapons would prevent it. So removing Kim Jong-un, would that be, by definition, a panacea? It could be movement in that direction, but to be very honest with you, when we saw Kim Jong-un, I certainly felt that way, come in to replace Kim Jong-il, I thought that would be movement in a positive direction. Obviously, I was wrong.
Yeah, so the honest answer is we don't know. I mean, it goes back to, and I agree with everything that was just said. And we don't know because the place is opaque. It's very hard to get an understanding of the inner circle, who's advising him, who might emerge in the aftermath of Kim leaving the scene. We just don't know. And then even if you knew, like in the case of Kim Jong-un, it's very easy to come up with the wrong analysis. I mean, I too thought Kim Jong-un might be a brighter light, right? That he would see where North Korea needed to go, right? And he would see that North Korea was heading down a path that was going to lead to more and more and more distance from the rest of the world and more costs on the society. And it's just wrong. He turned out to be just the opposite. So we don't know enough about the place, and we need to know more, and that's a whole nother story. But the honest answer is if he left the scene tomorrow, and I had to talk about it on television, I would say, we don't have a very good idea where this is headed.
You both brought up the nuclear threat, and I want to talk a little bit about that because the average American may read the papers and see failed missile tests, even failed nuclear tests, and think, well, they're nowhere near a weapon. But the key is every failed test provides more and more information to eventually get it right. So how far are they from creating a viable nuclear threat? It's a two-part question. One, to their immediate neighbors, and two, to the United States.
So this is an interesting issue because I think the media has it wrong. So if you read the media, you will see the media say they are 3 years away from having a nuclear weapon that could be placed on the continental United States. 4 years, 5 years in some cases. But the implication is that they're not there yet. My personal assessment is that they may have it today. Why do I say that? We know they have nuclear devices with absolute certainty. They've tested a number of them, some successful. So we know they have nuclear devices. They have deployed, but not tested, an ICBM called the KN-08, capable of reaching most of the continental United States, as advertised. We know that they've got the technical capability to miniaturize and to mate a nuclear device to a missile, which makes it a weapon. And we know that they've had enough time from the time they've had a nuclear device and they've had medium-range ballistic missiles to actually do that work. So I think it is possible that they may have that capability today. The way the former DNI Jim Clapper puts it is we have to assume that they have that capability. The reason this is so important, this question of do they have it now or are they 3 years away from having it? And the difference, by the way, is between an assessed capability and a demonstrated capability. They haven't demonstrated it yet. Doesn't mean they don't have it. The reason this is so important is because when most people talk about the U.S. taking military action against North Korea to try to do something about this problem we have, they talk about North Korea's conventional capabilities and the threat to the south, or their short and medium-range missile capabilities and the threat to the south. If you believe that there's a possibility that they may have a capability to put nuclear weapons on the United States today, then that military attack, the North Korean reaction to that, becomes much, much more interesting and much, much more dangerous. So this is a very important question.
Well, let me just say I totally agree with everything that Michael said. You know, and I agree on the ICBM, KN-08, KN-14. This is something they've been working on for a number of years, and I think a fair assessment would be we have to assume they have a capability. Now, have they tested the KN-08? We've not seen it. They've got to still mate. Thank you very much. Thank you. They still have to mate a nuclear warhead, which is something else. So there are issues there that there's got to be. But having said that, we've seen over the last year progress on an intermediate range ballistic missile with the capability of going over 4,000 kilometers. Solid fuel, mobile. Some of the rockets that were used, we've also seen submarine launched ballistic missiles. And some of the rockets there. So there is elements there that lend itself to the ICBM. It's not that the pieces aren't there. It's a question of putting them all together and then putting that nuclear warhead, a miniaturized nuclear warhead, and re-entering the atmosphere and so forth. So I think some would say, I agree, I think they probably have an ICBM that could technically, look, they have a Taepodong 2. I mean, technically, Taepodong 2 could reach the United States. Why did Ash Carter and Bill Perry in 1999 in an editorial, an op-ed in the New York Times say, it's sitting on the launch pad, take it off because that Taepodong 2 could reach the United States. Yes, they have the capability. So they have all the pieces. So by definition, they are or will quickly be an existential nuclear threat to the United States, as they've been to South Korea and Japan for a number of years. So yes, thank you. North Korea has progressed significantly, and I can't emphasize that enough.
And really important, right, to point out that even a medium-range ballistic missile test tells you a lot of what you need to know about an ICBM, and even failed missile tests you learn from. So all of this, I couldn't agree more in terms of the speed with which they are advancing their nuclear and missile capabilities. Can I kind of answer a different question? So one of the things I think is, One of the things I think is really, really important to think about is why are we in kind of this semi-crisis with North Korea today? Why weren't we there 6 months ago? Why weren't we there a year ago? Their capabilities today are not that different than they were 6 months ago or a year ago. They're advancing, but they're not significantly advanced. They haven't crossed a threshold in the last few months. So why are we in this situation? And the answer, my answer, I'd love to hear Joe's, but my answer is that we have a new president. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that it's Donald Trump. We'd be going through exactly the same thing if Hillary Clinton was president. And here's why. Here's why. The Clinton and Bush administrations dealt with North Korea in the following way. Whenever they rattled the cage, we would go to the negotiating table. And at the negotiating table, we would give them something irreversible, like food aid or fuel aid, for something reversible, like simply shutting down a nuclear reactor. And then guess what? A year later or 2 years later, that reactor's operating again. And what do? We go back to the negotiating table and we buy the same thing again. Barack Obama came to office and said, this is a nutty way of doing business. Why should we be rewarding them for advancing their programs? And he basically stopped talking to them. It was called strategic patience. But we basically stopped running to the negotiating table and giving them stuff for misbehaving. So the reason we're seeing so much activity, so many missile tests, possibility of another nuclear test, is because Kim Jongun wants to get back to where his dad was by sitting down with the West, particularly the United States, and not negotiating away his nuclear weapons. He has no plan to ever do that. But he wants to sit down and negotiate with us and have us give him things, right, in exchange for virtually nothing. That's why we're seeing this rapid number of tests. They were trying to get us to the negotiating table.
That's a fantastic point. I'm really proud of myself for asking that question that led to that. So we've talked a lot about the potential, even today, of having an ICBM, and even use the word existential threat. So I want to circle back again to my rational actor question in the very beginning. We've counted for the last 70 plus years on a deterrence, a conventional deterrence against nuclear Armageddon with the Soviets and even with the Chinese and others. Will the fact that we have thousands of nuclear weapons we could respond to any attack from North Korea make a difference in Kim Jong-un's decision to use nuclear weapons in defense of his sovereignty in North Korea?
You know, it's a very difficult question because you got to look at the nuances there. When you say in the defense of his system, how he would see defense, how he would see a threat to his system. If it's, they speak about their nuclear program as, we have a nuclear deterrent. It's a nuclear deterrent. It will prevent you from doing something to harm us, if you will, regime change or something along that line. So again, we don't know the calculus of this man. And again, that element of unpredictability. So what would be a threat? What would be the catalyst for him to say, I need to do something? We don't see him, at least I, looking at it for a number of years, don't see him as suicidal. I think he wants to sustain power and keep it going and so forth. So there's that element there. He's not going to be, in our terms, reckless by using something because he knows the responsibility. It would be the end. And I don't think he'll look at that. However, an element of miscalculation, an element of stumbling into something, an element of misunderstanding, of getting bad information, assuming something is always there. So by definition, North Korea with nuclear weapons, just by definition, never mind the point that he could sell them, they could find their way into terrorist organizations, or other states would then seek nuclear weapons capabilities, i.e. South Korea, Japan, et cetera. The whole element of miscalculation in having those nuclear weapons, so by definition is there. So a Kim Jong-un with nuclear weapons is, I hate to put it this way, an existential threat to the region, and certainly eventually to the United States. And I just feel very strongly about that point. Comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization has to be our goal and objective.
So I think he understands that if he uses them, that is pretty much the end of his regime. But I believe that he might well use them if he thought that his regime was falling and it was even a small probability that his regime could survive if he used them. I think that's the situation in which he would use them. And I agree with Joe that this is ripe for miscalculation. I just told you that he believes the United States is trying to overthrow him. And so he'll see everything through that prism. He might even see a domestic uprising, right, as a U.S. attempt to overthrow him. So it is extraordinarily dangerous. Most wars start because of miscalculation. Nobody in the First World War wanted to go to war. Nobody in that war wanted to go to war, and it happened anyway. So I think it is very dangerous for the reasons Joe said. And Joe mentioned something else really important here, which is there's just not the threat of use. There are actually three threats here. One is the threat of use. One is the threat of sale, selling a nuclear weapon to another country or to a non-state actor pretending to be another country. That's a scary thought. And before you say, no, he would never do that, realize that he's already sold the technology to make fissile material for a weapon. He sold it to Syria. And they built a reactor in the desert identical to the reactor that he has at Yongbyon. And the Israelis erased it from the face of the planet. So he's already demonstrated a willingness to sell the technology. And then the third threat is loose nukes. Is in a collapse scenario, right, in North Korea, who controls the nuclear weapons and what happens to them. So all three of those are very serious threats.
So let's actually take nuclear weapons off the table, because I think people are coming to the wrong conclusion that North Korea, even without nuclear weapons, would be an easy war if it goes to that. The conventional forces of North Korea are extraordinarily large. I think 700,000 soldiers who are active military. And there's enough conventional artillery to turn Seoul, a city of about 25 million people, into dust. Not to mention the fact that there's cyber weapons. Somehow North Korea has like 3 computers and they end up being incredibly effective using cyber attacks. And the kind of infiltration via tunnels into the south and special operations forces that would make a conventional war, without any nuclear weapons or even other weapons like bio or chemical weapons, a nightmare for everyone involved.
Michael, what's that?
Sure. I think a second Korean War would be extraordinarily deadly, extraordinarily damaging. Within literally 5 minutes of the war starting, there will be maybe 100,000 dead South Koreans. There is no doubt that South Korea and the United States would win that war, but the number of casualties would be reminiscent of the Second World War and the First World War. It would be extraordinary.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've seen some of what North Korea has with cyber capabilities. They've been working on asymmetrical capabilities, chemical, biological. They have and the conventional that you mentioned, Vince, there's no question. Sitting on the Kaesong Heights, that 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes going right into Seoul, it would be devastating. There's absolutely no question about that. And that's what makes it so difficult when we talk about responses, when we talk about preemption, and we go even left of preemption, what the calculus in a Kim Jongun and that leadership's mind would be of reacting to something that would be viewed as a threat to his leadership, a threat to the regime. And even when you get to the conventional side, you're absolutely right, because hopefully nuclear will never be used. But again, that element of miscalculation, a miscalculation is always in play there. So no matter how you look at it, this is not a very good scenario with a North Korea that continues to be recalcitrant, a threat, that continues to insist that they are going to do it on their terms. And that's, I think this is a credit to, in this case, the Trump administration. But I agree, I think any administration looking at it would say, look, we've tried all these different things. We tried strategic patience and so forth, and they've built more and more capabilities, and they're more and more of a threat. And we need to confront that threat, and it needs to be resolved. That's the point, ladies and gentlemen. If we could, somewhere as we finish this afternoon's conversation, and this will be ongoing, this is an issue that needs to be resolved, ideally peacefully resolved.
A lot of people have been looking to China as kind of the catalyst to that resolution. The Trump administration looked to China very overtly for since January. And then recently, Donald Trump tweeted out that, China tried, at least they tried, but he was no longer looking to China to do this. My question is, number one, did they really try? Because it seems like during the time period that they quote unquote tried, they still had no decrease in the kind of money and supplies and support given to North Korea. In fact, there are some statistics that it went up by almost 40% since Donald Trump became president. And number two, are they the key? I mean, they certainly have a vested interest in not having a second Korean War, because the millions of refugees that would spill over the border would be extraordinary, and the upheaval to economic trade and relationships would be almost cataclysmic. So how much can we count on China to be a willing partner in this relationship? Or are they just as lost as the rest of us and had to deal with Kim Jongun?
So I spent a lot of time with my Chinese colleagues talking about this question. And my view is that there's two separable issues here. One is their willingness to use their economic relationship to try to pressure the regime in North Korea to better behavior. And then the other is, even if they are willing, would they be able? Those are two separate questions, right? So on the willingness question, I simply don't think they're willing. I don't think they're willing because, number one, they fear an unstable nuclear-armed North Korea more than they fear a nuclear-armed North Korea. They fear, and I'll come back to this instability question in a moment, they fear that instability in the north will lead to hundreds of thousands of refugees flowing into China. And number three, they fear that instability in the north will lead to a reunification of Korea with a Korea that's allied with the United States on China's border. Three reasons why they fear instability. What does that have to do with their willingness? They're concerned that if they use their economic relationship to try to pressure North Korea, that it could lead to instability in the north. So they link those two things. So I have never seen them try. They didn't try recently. They didn't try because they don't want to, because they fear that instability for those three reasons. The second point is, I think if they did try, they wouldn't be any more successful than anybody else who's put sanctions on them. Kim Jong-un sees these weapons and these programs as key to the survival of his regime. And I don't believe, it may be our goal that he gets rid of them. I don't think we're going to be able to convince him to do that, and I don't think China is going to be able to convince him to do that. It's my own personal view.
So those are good points, Michael. One, I believe China is the key to resolving the North Korea nuclear issue with U.S. participation and South Korea's participation and Japan's participation. It's just not China, but certainly China is the key. Secondly, I agree, China has not used all the tools that are available to China. We hear in 2017, China is stopping the importation of coal, which is significant. We're talking about that can be close to $1 billion. Now, have they front-loaded it or something? That's something else. But there are other cards China has. Over 90% of the crude oil that North Korea needs to sustain the economy comes from China. They can start modulating that. They can start cutting that back. And I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, anyone who's looked at North Korea's infrastructure and economy, if they start cutting back on crude oil, you will get Kim Jong-un's attention and immediate attention on that. Also, what have we done on the China piece? We know that a number of Chinese banks and entities, business entities, are facilitating some of the stuff that gets into North Korea, despite the significant sanctions that have been imposed. So we talk about secondary sanctions. I think that's a fair point to make. I think anyone like China says, and they reiterated over the past weekend, that they committed to comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea, and they're with President Trump on this issue. And I do believe they do not want a nuclear North Korea, but they don't want instability. I totally agree with you on that. There's no question about that. So that means we need to have more of a meaningful dialogue with China to say, you need to police your own banks and entities to ensure that North Korea is being squeezed. They're not getting the resources necessary to sustain their missile and their nuclear programs. China, you need to do that. And you maybe need to use some of those other cards, like crude oil and so forth, to make it clear to Kim Jongun, we're just not going to tolerate this. Because what we've done, ladies and gentlemen, over the years is I hate to put it this way, but to be blunt, we have tolerated North Korea to escalate exponentially nuclear missile capabilities, to threaten the region and the world, and certainly to include the United States and so forth. And we've not used all the tools that are available to us. Many of them are available to us. I think China could be much more active in that area. And I think if Kim Jong-un sees the country crumbling, look, let's be candid. There are two North Koreas. One is Pyongyang, where the elites live, and the other is the rest of North Korea. But when he sees the elites and that element of Pyongyang crumbling also, maybe that will get the attention. It may not, but we still have tools available to us that we need to use, and we need to use them quickly.
Let's talk about our regional allies, because there's a lot of very nervous countries surrounding North Korea today. This week, the South Korean President Moon, is in Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump. At the same time, there's an article from the other day that Japan is starting to institute essentially what are duck and cover drills like we did back in the 1950s as a means of preparing their people for a potential North Korean attack. Are we doing enough to placate our allies, for lack of a better word, to soothe our allies that we are willing to come to their defense? I know we've deployed THAAD missile systems, which is a relatively short-range anti-ballistic missile system, to the region. Are we doing enough to keep, one of you mentioned, I don't remember who, South Korea or Japan from nuclearizing themselves? Because that is the real fear, right? The idea is that if we don't do enough, these countries will take their defense into their own hands.
Well, that's understandable. If countries feel our extended nuclear deterrence is going to be problematic, that nuclear umbrella is going to be problematic with time, I think it's understandable. Look, in the 70s, Taiwan was seeking a nuclear capability. South Korea was seeking a nuclear capability. I don't think there's any mystery there that countries will say, look, if we can't get assurances from the United States, well, then we're going to do it ourselves. Yeah, so the answer to your question is absolutely. And that's why we have to be there. And that's whether it's with the THAAD, missile defense, whether it's the joint military exercises, trilateral cooperation, we have to bring it together. We have to be there very close with our allies. Because let's face it, they're living in that area. When we talk about existential nuclear threat, they've been living with this for years. We're now starting to experience it.
We also need to be aware that there are different views in the region about North Korea. You could argue, I'm not arguing it, but you could argue that President Trump helped elect the new South Korean president with the very, very tough rhetoric about North Korea. There's a deep concern in South Korea about a conventional war with the North. And so the new South Korean president has a different approach to the North. He wants to talk to the North in a way that the previous government didn't. So while they want to feel we have their backs, there might be different views about what's the best approach to North Korea. I think the Japan piece is interesting too, because I think Japan wants to be much more reassured about China than it does about North Korea. I think Japan actually enjoyed the very tough rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration about North Korea and putting the aircraft carrier battle group up against Korea, but not because of Korea, because of the message it sent to China. So it's very, very complicated out there. But it's going to come back to the previous conversation for a minute because I think it's really important. One of the ways to think about this is to think about how Kim Jong-un might see two different paths forward. One path forward is the current path, where he continues down the road of strengthening his strategic weapons programs and maybe demonstrating the capability of delivering a nuclear weapon. By the way, he may choose never to demonstrate it. He may choose to be like Israel and leave it vague, right? Why try to demonstrate it and fail? Why not just leave it vague whether you can do it or not? So it's possible he never demonstrates. But let's say he continues to move down that road. What does that road look like, right? That, for North Korea, that's more of the same. That's more economic sanctions. Maybe the Chinese start piling on with their own economic sanctions, although they'll do it extraordinarily slowly for the reasons I said, I think. So their economy, the North Korean economy gets, it's stuck. It either gets worse or it's just stuck. The North Korean people continue to live in the horrible conditions in which they live. Life does not get better in any way for North Korea. And in the world around them, what happens? We defend ourselves with missile defense. The South Koreans defend themselves. The Japanese defend themselves. Maybe the South Koreans and the Japanese go down the nuclear road themselves if they have questions about whether the U.S. will be there or not. So even the security world around North Korea gets worse. So that sounds pretty bad, right? So that sounds like a Kim Jong-un who should want to come to the negotiating table and have a conversation and see where he might be able to go if he was willing to negotiate away these weapons, right? So that then takes you to path two. Path two is Kim Jong-un sitting down with the United States. The other countries would be there, but the only country he really cares about is the United States. To sit down with the United States and to negotiate away those weapons in return for an end to the war, normalization of relations, and to some degree of openness, right? Trade with the United States, outside investment, right? A much better life for North Korea and its people. That sounds pretty good until you put yourselves in Kim Jong-un's shoes. When you put yourself in Kim Jong-un's shoes, the second path looks much worse than the first path. Why? Because he sees the second path as an end to the regime. Because he sees, and for two reasons. Any opening with the world, right, is much more visibility on the part of his people into how far behind they are, number one. And more importantly, number two, he needs an enemy. He cannot have a negotiate, in my view, Joe might feel differently, he cannot have a negotiated settlement with the United States of America because he needs us as an enemy. And he needs us as an enemy because he has to justify what he asks of his people. And without that enemy, he's in real political trouble, I think. So path two for him, while it sounds great to us, looks horrible to him. Path one, while it's bad for him, looks much better.
No, can I take a two-finger on that? How's that?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, your points are very good. Let me just say, and I don't disagree with the final analysis. I don't see Kim Jong-un giving up his nuclear weapons. I think everyone's in agreement on that. And they tell us very clearly. They look at Gaddafi and Saddam and someone say, you just want us to give it up? Yeah, right. Yeah, I can visit Washington if I give up my nuclear weapons. Yes, I don't think so. So we know. I think that's a fair assumption. I think some are saying, and I'm certainly one of them, is that going to the final analysis may be too far a jump, too far to us to anticipate because there's so many variables in between. So much could happen. But there should be an immediate objective to diffuse some of the significant tension and the possibility for miscalculation and so forth. And that's where people are talking about halting. and this is, we were close with the administration, the Obama administration, on the basically the 29 February Leap Day Agreement, where North Korea had agreed to a moratorium on missile launches and nuclear tests. What some are saying, and I think we're in agreement on that, if we could get North Korea to halt their nuclear tests, missile launches, and the production of fissile material, we're not giving you anything, no peace treaty or anything like that. If you want to talk, now if North Korea doesn't want to talk, if North Korea eschews anything that speaks to a dialogue, obviously we just have to ratchet up that tension, as we talked about a minute ago. We've got a lot of levers, just put it up there, and that's where China has to play a lot, because as North Korea is squeezed economically and so forth, that element of instability then becomes innate to the country. And that's not in China's interest either. So to get them to modulate, to at least give something with the anticipation that they'll get something. So if we can get them to halt what they're doing, to include the fissile material production and see where that can go, not giving them anything in return on that, and so forth. But let me just end on this one point, though. And I totally agree with you on this, Michael. If we just leave North Korea unto itself and basically isolate it and so forth, the leader will indicate very clearly we're a siege mentality. It's them against us, and we need these nuclear weapons. The point is to try to take that away from him. Take that away from him to induce, even with China hopefully, more of a relationship with the outside world so they can see what's happening in South Korea. Sure, that will be a threat to him, but then that's his challenge. And there are variables within North Korea that we don't know. That could be, he took out people because obviously he felt threatened by these people. There may be other people he feels threatened with, or maybe he's not aware of, that he needs to look at. So I guess some of us are saying that although we agree in the final analysis, forget denuclearization, forget all that stuff, and so forth, and there's no way they're going to normalize if, one, they have nuclear weapons and they continue with their gulags and they continue with their illicit activities. But the point is, try to diffuse it at this moment now and see if we can get some momentum.
An open North Korea would finally show the North Korean people that they haven't won every single Olympic medal in the last 4 Olympics.
I thought they did.
Yeah. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, everyone was happy for a little bit until in West Germany they looked to the east and said, oh God, their infrastructure is so far behind. This is going to be a heavy, heavy lift to try to unify these two systems that are so different because of decades of Cold War. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet compared to any attempt at unification of North and South Korea. The best case scenario tomorrow, maybe for a lot of us, is that Kim Jongun just says, you're right, let's come together, let's all be like South Korea and be unified. But that would be a absolute, we're gonna get a little wonky here, an absolute economic nightmare for the South Koreans and for the United States as, you know, the client of the South Koreans. Talk a little bit about how this is not an easy solution to a problem.
So I was just going to say that there's been studies done about what the costs would be to unification, and they dwarf. They just dwarf what the costs were to German unification, for all the reasons you said. These two systems could not be more far apart than they are. The language is starting to diverge between the North and the South. The dialects being created. The people in the North have been so malnourished for so long that they're of a different size than the people in the South. I mean, it would be staggering. You would have to essentially, if in a unified Korea, you would have to essentially still keep them separate. And slowly open up the people-to-people contacts and the flows of people. It could not happen overnight. It would be a staggering cost that would have to be shared. South Korea could not carry the burden on its own. Japan, China, the United States would all have to contribute. So it would be extraordinarily difficult. But having said all that, would that be a problem I'd like to have? Absolutely.
I agree with all of that.
So let me ask you about the current administration. Whether anyone in this room may have problems with the amount of attention paid to foreign policy of the current administration, there is key consensus that Donald Trump pays really close attention to the North Korean problem. Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, in a recent article says every single day they have a conversation about North Korea. My question is about message discipline, however. Are we sending conflicting, confusing messages not only our allies in the region, but also to North Korea itself, when there is a different message coming out of state, out of DOD, out of the intelligence agencies, and out of the White House, and actually sometimes multiple messages coming out of the White House. In a relationship like this, a diplomatic relationship that depends on having everybody on the same page so that there is no miscalculation or misunderstanding, how dangerous is this, and are we seeing it getting better, perhaps, as the months have gone by?
So let me do the big picture, and then you can do North Korea.
Yeah.
Okay?
I wasn't sure I was talking about North Korea. No.
Let me do the big picture. I'm a huge fan of Secretary Shultz, former Secretary of State. And whenever he talks about foreign policy, he says, you know, foreign policy is a pretty easy thing. If you do three things. If you say what you mean, if you do what you say, and if you carry a big stick, things will work out. So let's take a look at how this administration is doing on those three areas, right? Let's start with the big stick. Our stick was eroded significantly in the last few years for both policy reasons and for budgetary reasons. The president says the right things about rebuilding the stick. The rhetoric is all correct about rebuilding the stick. His first budget was only 3% higher. First defense budget was only 3% higher than what Obama's budget would have been for the same year. So the rhetoric is there about rebuilding the stick, but the money's not there yet. So let's give them a C on that, right? Move down to do what you say. President Trump enforced President Obama's red line on Syrian use of chemical weapons. It's a very good thing in my view. Syrian President Assad will not use chemical weapons again against his own people. He will not. He has been deterred because of what President Trump did. So that's you know, first test on the saying what you mean, right? Doing what you say. That's the first test, so give him a B+. Then you come back to the say what you mean, which is your question. And here I give them an F. They're all over the map. There's discordance between the president and his national security team on all sorts of issues. There's discordance among the president himself. One day saying, and I'll leave North Korea to you, but there's discordance among the president himself, right? Clarity of message in foreign policy is extraordinarily important. You can argue that, and I'm not arguing this, but you could argue that Assad's use of those chemical weapons in the first place was a response to some in the administration saying we weren't interested in Assad going away anymore. So what you say is really, really important. I've been around a lot of people who have said, don't watch what the president says, watch what he does. And my response is always, you know, in foreign policy and national security, what you say really, really matters. What the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad said to Saddam Hussein about his border dispute with Kuwait was a major factor in Saddam's decision to invade Kuwait. He thought he got the green light from her. So what you say is extraordinarily important, and the administration is not saying the same thing, and that's extraordinarily dangerous.
You know, and we have an opportunity right now, excuse me, to do exactly what you're saying, though, Michael, to say and to do what we're saying. What we just saw, ladies and gentlemen, over the last 2 weeks with the horrific death of Otto Warmbier should be enough of an incentive for the United States, and certainly our allies, and indeed China in this equation also, to see something like that, to say enough. This is not a missile launch. It's not a nuclear test, and we're looking at the potential for a sixth nuclear test. You just killed an American. Enough. So if the rhetoric has been out there, if we've been all over the map, now is the time not to be all over the map. It's to focus, to come up with the strategy, and I believe the administration has worked on the strategy, and that includes China in a significant way, using all the levers we have in a significant way. That means us, you spoke about Moon Jae-in coming in a few days, visiting. That means South Korea being on board with us, with THAAD, with trilateral cooperation, maybe trilateral military operations. We need to bring it all together to say to Pyongyang and to Kim Jongun, that's it. We will not tolerate any more. And that's going to be very key. That's going to be very key. And I can tell you this, and we heard a little of this from Pyongyang with their very weak commentary over the weekend that they were being humanitarian by the release of Otto Warmbier. That's absurd. That's even more of an affront to the people of the United States and certainly the family of Otto Warmbier and so forth. So this is it, ladies and gentlemen. So let's see, Michael, what happens now, because we have a very specific issue here. It's front and center. It has all the countries, to include China over this past weekend, and the good visit of Xi Jinping with President Trump and so forth. And the president and the national security community coming together over the last few months and coming up with a strategy. Now let's put it all together, and then let's move forward and implement it.
Let me wrap this up with a brief thought experiment. This can be relatively short in answer. Since it's a thought experiment, you can't say you don't know, right? You actually have to come with an answer to this. But let's jump ahead 10 years. Where is this relationship? Where is this situation 10 years from now?
So I'd say a couple things. I'll get to your answer, right? I'll get to the question. But 3 administrations have dealt with this problem. Clinton, Bush, Obama. They all started out thinking that they could manage the problem, that they could do something to slow, stop, end the weapons programs. By the end of the 8 years for each of them, they realized that this was an extraordinarily difficult problem. There are no easy answers here. Each of them learned that. And I have a feeling that the Trump administration is going to learn that too. There's nothing there. If there was anything easy, it would have been done already. The second point I'd make is that, like Joe, I've been dealing with this for a long time because I grew up as an analyst looking at East Asia, and I actually spent a good chunk of my career working on North Korea. And it was it was my view, and it was the view of all my fellow analysts, and quite frankly, anybody who was looking at North Korea, that this regime could not last much longer, that this regime would collapse. So I first started looking at North Korea in the late 1980s, and I thought it had 10 more years. Well, I still think it has 10 more years. And in 10 years, I'm going to be saying the same thing. So where will we be? In 10 years, North Korea's weapons programs will be much more significant than they are today in number and capability. Maybe they will have demonstrated the capability to put a nuclear weapon on the continental United States. Maybe not, but perhaps. And we, the Japanese, the South Koreans, will have built missile defense robustly in South Korea, Japan, Hawaii, Alaska, and California. And we'll essentially be in a standoff. That's what I think.
You know, I think I alluded to it a few minutes ago. I think we're at this inflection point where it's either going to get somewhat better with some potential, or it's going to get worse very, very quickly. And that's where we are. And I think we have some of the tools to move that forward. And I think that we're seeing this with this administration. I think any administration looking at what's going on now realizes we have to be proactive and get there. If you're extrapolating and looking at 10 years down the road, I think history is important when you look at these equations. When you look at just the region itself, whether it's Burma with Aung San Suu Kyi, who would have thought Aung San Suu Kyi with Ne Win, who was there many years ago, this dictatorial government, Park Geun-hye in South Korea in the 60s and so forth, an autocrat and so forth. Who would have seen such a vibrant democracy in South Korea? The KMT that went into Taiwan in 1949 that slaughtered the Taiwan people and everything, and now it's one of the most vibrant democracies when we look at Taiwan. JCPOA are obviously looking at possibly changing a government, but we did see with the Green Revolution. So I guess what I'm saying here is there's sometimes a catalyst from within countries. Within countries, the dynamics that we can't control, and sometimes we don't even understand, within countries that will affect change. And the change we have seen, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it's some of those other countries, is movement towards the people saying enough is enough and so forth. So where do I see 10 years? I see 10 years as long as we see this as a critical issue, we use all the cards that we have available to us now, that we don't see a further escalation of what we see right now, and movement towards, I won't say we will ever achieve that in 10 years, movement towards dismantlement. But I think most important in that equation is the ability to open up North Korea, because when you look at all those other countries, it was access to what was going on in other countries, whether it's in the region, East Asia, the Pacific, South Asia, the West. When they see that dynamic there, how that opens up societies within, and we certainly see it recently in the Middle East with the Arab Spring and so forth, and how that creates something. The ability to open up North Korea should be one of our major goals.
Can I just add one point? Whether or not we're at an inflection point will depend on what the United States does. And that's the policy decision to be made, right? Do we pursue the inflection point or not? The upside of doing it is you can end up in a slightly better situation and maybe be on the road to a better situation. But there's a risk associated with it that it could get a lot worse. So that's the fundamental policy conundrum here, right? And I hope they really discuss it carefully, because it's a big, big deal on both sides.
So I'm going to kick it back to Rebecca, but before that, please join me in thanking Joe DeTrani and Michael Morell for taking the time to talk to us today. Oh, it's up to you. Okay, so you are waving me off saying we do have time for some questions. All right, so never mind. So we are going to have some time for some questions. I thought you were giving me so there's a microphone or two going around at some point. No, you're going to have to yell out. No. Amanda has a microphone, so she's going to choose who gets asked the question. So it's her fault.
Take the thought experiment a little bit further. If I could give you a future historian who would just tell you one item that in fact this had ended in a nuclear exchange, retrospectively, when might you wished we had forced it earlier? Pure thought experiment here. But if indeed this is headed all the way downhill, when would we look back and say, missed that one?
So I actually believe, and I'd love to hear what Joe thinks, I actually believe that we missed the window for military activity, military action on our part. That window was open at one point because the risks were less than they are today. I won't be specific about it because it would take too long and I don't want to go into it, but I do think we missed the opportunity.
So I would say, and I agree with Michael on that, I would say there is still a piece that speaks to preemption. Because I don't think any country, certainly not the United States, is going to sit here and watch North Korea launch an ICBM with the potential of having a nuclear warhead. And we're just going to sit here and watch it. And now, being the mobile systems, we may not be able to see it on a launch pad as we did in 1999 with Ash Carter and Bill Perry saying, take it off the launch pad. That means that gets into missile defense, that gets into other things there. But we as a nation and the international community, the world would expect, and certainly the American people would expect us to do something to take that system out. So I think there are a lot of kinetic pieces that are involved with preemption, whether it's missile defense and joint military action and operations and so forth. But we have to keep that in mind. We cannot be threatened. We cannot be intimidated by a North Korea with nuclear weapons.
Can I add another thought to the question, which is really good? When I was a Japan analyst, Japan economic analyst, the Japanese financial system was in very, very bad shape. And I was asked to brief the deputies in the U.S. government, so the number twos, right, at all the agencies. And so I gave them this briefing, and Larry Summers, who was then the deputy Treasury Secretary, came up to me afterwards and said, "You didn't help me." Not exactly what I wanted to hear. But he said, "You didn't help me. I knew everything you said. I know how bad the situation is. What I really needed you to do was to tell me a story about how we could get from where we are today to financial collapse, and then tell me a second story about how we could get from where we are today to financial stability." So if I were back in my old job as Deputy Director of CIA, I would ask my analysts to do that on North Korea, to write two future histories. Tell me how we go from today to a nuclear exchange with North Korea, and tell me how we would go today to denuclearization, go all the way. Tell me those two stories, because when you tell those kind of stories, you give policymakers ideas about what they can do, and you give them a sense of the key signposts to watch for which path you're on. So I would ask them to do that thought experiment.
Thank you. My question is about the role of diplomacy. The government of Sweden represents our interests in Pyongyang, and yet we never hear any mention of the Swedes helping us in any way. And I'm particularly thinking of the situation, the tragic death of Otto Warmbier. And then second part, what's with Dennis Rodman?
Well, he used to be a good basketball player. No.
I made it my personal mission not to bring up Rodman during this, but since it's a question.
Well, the Swedish ambassador, we have that arrangement with the government of Sweden, that would have access to the Americans who are being detained, were detained, are being detained. And tragically, Otto Warmbier was not seen by the Swedish ambassador or anyone from the embassy there. And they do represent us there. So your point's a very good point. North Korea needs to explain that. Look, North Korea has a lot of explaining to do with Otto Warmbier, with the Swedish ambassador, their embassy, why they were not given access. And they need to move quickly on releasing those 3 Americans who are still being held hostage in North Korea. They need to do that. When you talk about Dennis Rodman, let me just say this. And I don't want to put it with table tennis in China in 1972 and so forth, because certainly North Korea is not China. But the fact of the matter is, the more interchange, and it's not, as long as, and I think Dennis Rodman tried at this visit, because I'm sure he makes himself available when he comes in town, and I think the North Koreans see that. But I mean, that's one manifestation of who we are. This young man, Kim Jongun, when he was in Switzerland, liked basketball, and that's his affinity.
He loves basketball.
He loves basketball.
He loves basketball.
There you go. So I mean, so that's a little something, and I wouldn't discourage something like that, to be very honest with you. I would say yes. The more Dennis Rodmans and other, whether it's the actors and actresses, and whether it's authors and scientists and so forth, open it up.
One more question.
Suppose the Chinese government were to say, we will apply such sanctions against North Korea as you wish, for as long as you like, even an economic blockade, in return for ending any implicit or explicit security guarantee for Taiwan. What would you think of that offer?
Let me just say, and I'll look to Michael on this one, I would never put Taiwan in the same equation. We should never use Taiwan as a bargaining chip.
I agree 100%. It would be a huge strategic mistake for the United States to go down that road.
Okay, so now please join me in thanking Joe DeTrani and Mike Morell.